afternoon, and welcome to this ethics session of our International Aquinas at 800 conference. So our first presenter today is Michael Krom. He's a chair of philosophy and director of Benedictine Leadership Studies at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He's the author of Justice and Charity, An Introduction to Aquinas' Moral, Economic, and Political Thought, and is working on a monograph tentatively entitled Aquinas Among the Benedictines. His paper today is entitled We Descend by Self-exaltation and Ascend by Humility, Aquinas on Happiness and the Perfection of the Church. And just as a reminder, each paper will have 20 minutes, immediately followed by Q&A. And he has a handout that I'll be passing out.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Great, thanks, Luísa. Yeah, thanks for coming. The after lunch, last day session, so we made it. I'm going to start with just some context for the talk, and then I'll get into it. So I'm working on a book, tentatively called Aquinas Among the Benedictines, and the first part would be biographical, just looking at how Aquinas' time at Monte Cassino, and then Milan, and then finally Fossa Nova with the Cistercians influenced his life and his thought. Then from there, looking at virtue ethics and looking specifically at the virtues of humility, obedience, and religion under the guidance of charity. And, the basic claim is that this is central to Benedictine spirituality, and that St. Benedict himself thinks of humility and obedience as the virtues that one cultivates. There's these famous 12 steps of humility that Aquinas does actually write on those, and that when the monk has gone through this training school, that they then do all things out of the inexpressible delights of love, and that there's just a compatibility there and perhaps an influence from Benedictine spirituality. And then looking at religious life, which is the talk today. And then the last chapter would be looking at what we might call post-Aeterni Patris to Vatican II Benedictine intellectual and spiritual formation, how Aquinas influences them, thinking especially Blessed Columba Marmion and Eugene Boylan, who are important spiritual writers for Benedictines, and then Dom de Laet, who is the abbot of Salem, wrote a commentary on the rule that was widely used and also, again, very influenced by Aquinas. So I'm going to turn now again to the perfection of the church and states of life. So I want to begin with the point that while Aquinas places our attention on the perfection of an individual human person, he constantly reminds us that our own happiness is found through loving obedience to God's call to build up the body of Christ. For example, just before discussing the states of life, he makes it clear that while the contemplative life is the most perfect and meritorious in itself, quote number 1 on the handout, nevertheless, it may happen that one man merits more by the works of the active life than another by the works of the contemplative life. For instance, through excessive divine love, a man may now and then suffer separation from the sweetness of divine contemplation for the time being, that God's will may be done in his glories and for his glory's sake. Further, this obedience to God in pursuing the lower for the sake of the higher, or the love of neighbor for the sake of the love of God, requires humility in those who are called to it due to their own lack of perfection, quote number 2. He that is prone to yield to his passions on account of his impulse to action is simply more apt for the active life by reason of his restless spirit. Hence Gregory says that there be some so restless that when they are free from labor, they labor all the more, because the more leisure they have for thought, the worse interior turmoil they have to bear. The fact that one's own lack of virtuous self-mastery necessitates the acceptance of a lower way of life is a hard truth to humbly accept. And I'm sure some of us may be asking of ourselves after that tiramisu dessert, am I really worthy of the contemplative life? So above all, achieving the perfection of contemplation requires religious sacrifice of our very selves. Quote number 3. The more closely a man unites his own or another's soul to God, the more acceptable is his sacrifice to God. Wherefore it is more acceptable to God that one apply one's own soul and the souls of others to contemplation than to action. Again, the virtues of obedience, humility and religion, under the guidance of charity, are central in perfect happiness. And William of Tocco, in his Life of Aquinas, repeatedly mentions humility and obedience. Lots of virtues are discussed, but those two come up again and again in highlighting Aquinas' sanctity. As we turn to the states of life, we see Aquinas focusing our attention on the concrete act that serves as the foundation for the perfection of these four virtues, the vow. A focus on vows is a good transition to the overlooked dimensions of Aquinas' virtue theory that, while more clearly seen in his spiritual and mendicant controversy writings, are certainly present in his more technical treatment of them in the Summa. Quote number 4, "The perfect life of virtue is found in those who make a complete sacrifice of their own will for the love of God, submitting themselves to another by the vow of obedience. This obedience consists in the abnegation of our own will. Self-abnegation, or making oneself a simpliciter servus, a slave absolutely, is perfect virtue, whether or not one does this under the obligation of a vow." So there's an important qualification, quote number 5. "If a man dedicate his whole life to serve God in works of perfection, he absolutely embraces the condition or state of perfection. But as some men perform works of perfection without any vow, and others fail to accomplish the works of perfection to which they have vowed their whole lives, it is perfectly possible for persons to be perfect without being in the state of perfection, or to be in a state of perfection without being perfect." We see here Aquinas working directly not with pagan sources, such as Aristotle, Cicero, and Seneca, but with the fathers, especially Dionysius and Saints Augustine, Gregory the Great, and Benedict. Aquinas defines a state as, quote, "a kind of position whereby a thing is disposed with a certain immobility in a manner according with its nature. Given man's nature as a rational animal, it is fitting that he stands still in a position disposing him to rational action. Thus, while on the one hand, state inclines and enables a certain kind of action, on the other hand, it denotes restfulness, immobilitate or quiete. A state then both binds and liberates, and so is something pertaining to the nature of freedom or servitude. In human affairs, a state frees one to rule or binds one to service in spiritual or in civil matters. It is significant that status can also be translated as stability. For this points us back to the virtue of obedience as central to human perfection. The free acceptance of being bound to a certain role in society is central to the practice of charity. And with this comes the humble recognition that one's own perfection consists in mutual service that is incompatible with seeking one's own. To place one's life in the service of the perfection of the body of Christ and to will the justice of a society in which some are more perfect in their state than others is the life of virtue. In this sense, just as perfection, strictly speaking, consists in charity, but relatively consists in the practice of the virtues commanded by charity, so too does the perfect life of each one of us consist in personal fulfillment, yet is brought about relative to our role in society. This twofold perfection, absolute and relative, entails two things. First, one could achieve perfection by free acts to which one is not bound by one state. Second, those who inhabit a higher state of perfection than others are not necessarily more perfect than them. While Aquinas restricts the term state of perfection to religious and prelates, since the married do not take on the counsels, but only the commandments, the laity participate in perfection both via their membership in the body of Christ and in the freedom they possess to perform charitable actions to which they are not obligated by their state, for example, voluntary fasting. I have focused thus far on the virtues of obedience and humility as central to the life of charity, yet the states are directly relevant to the virtue of religion. For religion denotes properly a relation to God, for it is he to whom we ought to be bound as to our unfailing principle, to whom also our choice should be resolutely directed as to our last end. By establishing ourselves in a state, we are binding ourselves to God's service. Since the highest service to God is found in worship, and Aquinas' focus on religious and prelates as those members of the church who are bound in the states of perfection, we see the virtue of religion coming to the fore. While this is not the place to work through all of Aquinas' distinctions concerning the ranks or of the rankings of the states of perfection, we should especially note his reasoning in determining that prelates are higher than religious, since this directly bears upon the importance of the virtue of religion. Quote number 6. The preeminence of order excels in the point of dignity, since by holy orders a man is appointed to the most august ministry of serving Christ himself in the sacrament of the altar. For this requires a greater inward holiness than that which is requisite for the religious state, since, as Dionysius says, the monastic order must follow the priestly orders and ascend to divine things in imitation of them. The perfect life of charity, then, is found in humble obedience within one's state that frees one to perform the religious act of the rite of consecration, while the sacrifice that is specific to the virtue of religion can be practiced through acts of love for neighbor. This is of a lower order than the love of God that motivates us to participate in the sacrifice by which God unites us to him. To love God by receiving him in the Eucharist, and to love others by distributing the Eucharist to them, both perfects the prelate and the body of Christ. Finally, while religious life is of a lower state than the clerical, the fact that it is wrong to pursue the perfection of the bishop due to the presumptuousness of such a desire reminds us once again of the centrality of humility in the life of perfection, and points us toward the conclusion that those who desire perfection should seek out religious life. Here it is worth a brief look at how perfection plays out in religious life, the, quote, training school wherein one aims by practice at the perfection of charity. 3 points here. First, in this lower state of perfection in religious life, lower than the bishop, it is more clearly seen that the highest way of life, that of the contemplative, is to be sought in this life, and that it primarily consists in prayer and only secondarily in the study of sacred doctrine. Second, yet the freedom for contemplation enjoyed by those in this state is higher when it is directed to the active life of teaching and preaching. So the Dominican order then would be higher than, say, the Benedictine. Third, there's an exception. Those very few contemplative religious who achieve perfection through the contemplative life and surpass even those who teach and preach. In question 188 of the Secunda Secundae, Aquinas moves hierarchically upwards from religious orders committed to soldiering. That's a lot of fun. I had a seminarian who was in the Air Force. He loved reading that article. It was a good discussion. Yes, there can be religious orders committed to soldiering, to preaching and hearing confessions, to study, contemplation, and finally contemplation ordered toward the actions of preaching and teaching. While this active life rooted in contemplation can involve secular studies, it should always direct this to sacred doctrine and be done for the sake of confounding heretics, and that in turn be ordered toward prayer. Those monks in contemplative orders, and I'm sorry, we should look at number 7 there. I kind of skipped over that. I'm not going to read it, but the basic point is there are kind of 3 levels. The lowest level of religious life is the active life of corporal acts of mercy. The second highest then would be contemplative order, Benedictines, and then the highest would be the contemplative ordered toward preaching and teaching, and that would be, again, the Dominicans. But, again, those in the second order, the contemplative order, may pass on to the higher state. So look at quote number 8. Accordingly, just as that which is already perfect surpasses that which is being schooled in perfection, so the life of the solitaries, contemplatives, if duly practiced, surpasses the community life. But if it be undertaken without the aforesaid practice, it is fraught with very great danger, unless the grace of God supply that which others acquire by practice, as in the case of the Blessed Antony and the Blessed Benedict. So if you think you're already perfect and can do one-on-one combat in the desert with the devil, you should just see if you have humility, if maybe you really are perfect, or if you need to go to school in order to do that later on. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by reflecting on why, and I should mention, St. Benedict himself did that. So he ran away from school, lives in a cave, and then he says, don't do what I did. You know, that wasn't the way. Although Aquinas says it was because he had a special grace that he could do it. I conclude by reflecting on why attention to the saying of St. Benedict, we descend by self-exaltation and ascend by humility, helps us to see the breadth of the Christian tradition at work in Aquinas' thought, as well as the centrality of humility to our own efforts today to build up the body of Christ. If we are steeped in the Platonic as well as Aristotelian emphasis on the contemplative life, we will find ourselves wanting to view such virtues as humility and obedience as necessary only for the imperfect. Yet Aquinas insists, first of all, that all of us are imperfect, and even for those who are perfect, they need those virtues. Quote number 9 then. Actual obedience is required of those who need to be schooled according to the direction of others in the attainment of perfection, but those who are already perfect are sufficiently led by the Spirit of God so that they need not to obey others actually. Nevertheless, they have obedience in the preparedness of the mind, end quote. So, and I would say that, I'm an adult convert through intellectual life, through philosophy. I think I did conceive of the intellectual life of a Catholic as being the study, right? Going to theology, philosophy, studying the text. And then when I first converted, kind of like, you also pray. And I don't really know, like, okay, I guess like I'm supposed to be prepared to receive the Eucharist, and not realizing that prayer is the contemplative life. The study is for the sake of that. Strictly speaking, contemplative life is prayer. And especially anyone who's done a doctoral dissertation, you feel like, I don't have time to pray because I have very little time to get my doctorate done. And so prayer would be distracting me from my mission to contemplative life. And again, I'll go to church on Sunday, right? So I think Aquinas is very helpful in saying it is in the worship that we are contemplatives, strictly speaking. So the pursuit of happiness, compared to Aristotle, is much more circuitous, indirect, corporate, receptive than Aristotle would have it. So it's not, practical life, you involve in rule, then contemplative life, act as virtue demands. Aquinas does agree contemplative life, beatific vision, is the highest, but the way to it is very indirect because of these virtues of humility and obedience. So while the contemplative is the highest in this life, the active life rooted in contemplation is best, again, Dominican life, yet it cannot be taken up in the highest state, that of the bishop, except reluctantly and without being sought. And those who seek the second best state of life, which then would be the Dominican now, thereby they close themselves off from the contemplative life of the hermit. And unless they become bishops, they relegate themselves to a state that appeared highest at the outset, but which now reveals itself to be lower. And I refer to you to quote number 10, where he says that solitude is a means to perfection and that it is not appropriate for those who are involved in active ministries, like the Dominicans, except for a time, he says. And so the way that I'm seeing what Aquinas is giving us is that if you want to be perfect, you seek out a kind of what we might call a hidden life, a quiet life of humility, obedience, rooted in charity, that might then elevate you by the election by obedience to the superior, to the bishop, or to that of the hermit. But what we actually pursue is something that is lower. And someone reading the Rule of St. Benedict, looking at this, would say this is how Benedict ends the prologue by saying the school of the Lord's service he's setting up is one that at the beginning will appear very narrow. He says, don't run away in fear, but that as you progress through it, you're opened up to these inexpressible delights of love. And if you get that far at the end of chapter 73 of the Rule, this is just the beginning, and now the next stage, that one-on-one combat in the desert, that's the highest, But you sought very lowly things like working in the kitchen and being called to various duties by the abbot. So it is only through humility then and obedience under the guidance of charity that we ascend. Thank you. Okay, so I don't know who's calling. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael, for an insightful paper. One of the most non-polemical theologians in history, this is an incredibly polemical question. He has just finished dunking on the Franciscans in their views of poverty, and now he's dunking on the Cistercians and the Benedictines by assimilating to the Dominicans the life of bishops. They're pretty much as close as you can to get to bishops. In a later bit, he's going to actually say, well, in act, the Dominicans are even holier than the bishops. right? Because they're the bishops don't terribly exercise themselves in the life of the mind. That's one of my favorite lines. And so, I mean, what is your appreciation of how he's progressed on from those years at Monte Cassino? Because this is a really revolutionary idea. I mean, up until this time, the contemplative, the life of Mary, had been the top. Yeah. And he is introducing a new category that he advances. Not the mixed life is good, the mixed life is best.
Yeah.
And so how do you reconcile that with Benedict?
Yeah, and so then he does go on with the Franciscans, who he treats a bit more delicately, we might say, but the article on poverty is really long. I mean, it's by far the longest in there, his treatment of that. So I mean, let me start first with Benedict, that there's this question in original monasticism, it's living as a desert, a hermit alone, and that Benedict then is going to say, well, okay, again, that still is the best, but for most people, the life in community is necessary. And so he's trying to synthesize, I think, these two things. I think I'd say the same thing for Aquinas. I think that he ultimately he's in agreement with Benedict that while he does add a new possibility that Benedict didn't envision, a kind of monk that's good. Benedict has good monk and then bad monks. So there's not like different kinds of monks. There's the one good kind and then the bad ones. But in the end, I think he's agreeing with Benedict that the Dominican life is higher for the those. It's a higher order for the majority of religious, and yet the Benedictine order opens one up to something higher than the Dominicans. And that's what Benedict himself says in chapter 1 of the rule, that the hermits are higher than us, but you have to kind of go through this. So I think he's pulling out the rug from under the Dominicans at the end there. He's synthesizing these two in a way to say, you wanted to be perfect, and it turns out that this was not the highest possibility that you could pursue. And the one thing which I haven't done a lot of research on this, but St. Peter Damian was really influential at Monte Cassino, and a lot of his writings are there at Monte Cassino. And Aquinas is surely too young to be exposed to this, so I don't know how much it influenced the formation he got there. But St. Peter Damian was engaged in going to Monte Cassino and saying that the hermit order that he's founding would be for those who go through Benedictine life and are now looking for something in between being alone and community life. And that I think that development in Benedictine spirituality opens up another possibility there. So, yeah. Good, thank you. Good question.
Yeah, I have a question. So it's really interesting to think about how these passages complicate the picture of perfection in religious life, and obviously important for lay people to think about as well. I'm thinking, like, in the context of, we have 5 young daughters, and I'm searching to tell them, here's what is best to aim for in life, right? Mm-hmm. And I have no illusions that it's easier to, I know I would love to be a Dominican and just teach and preach and contemplate and not deal with, the material things of the world so much. So for me, it's kind of a sacrifice. But reading, so I no personal offense if you say, like, it's just a lower form of life, fine. But reading these things seems to complicate it in ways that I can then match up a lot more with family life done in a certain way. You have the community in the home, you have these constant acts of humility and constant kind of tensions in the teaching that should come out of contemplation that parents should be doing on their own and things like that. I don't know, it kind of like takes a simpler picture and makes it very messy, and then so I start wondering, how do we then say that the religious life really leads us more to perfection, unless we keep those terms so technical that, like you said, you can be more perfect, although not in a state of perfection.
Yeah. No, thanks. There's a lot to wrestle with here. And I think that just as we need to develop ecclesiology in Aquinas, we need to develop the lay life part, because he doesn't take it up directly, at least there. I mean, he's focused on religious life and the clerical. But I think his point is, as you mentioned, that one can achieve perfection in a lower state that would surpass others in a higher state. is really helpful as a starting point to think through that, and that when we come to just the personal question of what should I pursue, again, I'm seeking to be perfect. That quote at the very beginning where he says, well, if you find that when it's time for contemplative things you get restless, even if you like contemplative things, it's probably a sign that your way of pursuing perfection will be of a lower order than someone who could contemplate all day. But don't lose heart, then go from there to say, well, this is how I pursue perfection in a state that helps to build up the common good, right, of the church. And so this kind of lowliness, you could say, a good way of thinking about lowliness. And so then when you look at family life, I'd say, again, with being in a Benedictine community, I found this very helpful, is that isn't Aquinas ending up saying that if your vocation ends up being a lot of doing dishes and a lot of getting groceries and the material things, right, you realize all of those things can be done in a contemplative way. So the Benedictines they're manual labor-based order, right? So when he calls them contemplative, he's not saying they study and they contemplate. He's saying they do manual labor and then they go to the office. And so contemplative in the sense that it's all for the office, it's all for the work of God. And so can I too, in a married household, allow, I guess today we use this domestic church language, right, to say that all of those works, very little reading of Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas throughout the day, if I remember that it all can be punctuated by prayer in a way appropriate to a family, morning prayer, midday, evening, night, and so forth, means that I can have a participation in the true contemplative life. And I think that for Catholic lay intellectuals, they often think of contemplative life, I do, as being reading texts and going to conferences and those sort of things. And that's not what Aquinas is saying. He says you should do those things insofar as you need to help convert others, Albigensians and so forth, and to help you more perfectly pray. And probably a lot of us find that those readings are not actually conducive to prayer, but making it harder to pray, because I'm feeling like prayer is just this thing that's like, I've got to do it so I can get back to the study. And that's disordered, and guilty, right? So I don't know if that helps, but.
Maybe we have time for one quick question. Last question.
Well, thank you very much. This was spiritually quite helpful. This is just a request for further explanation, I guess, regarding maybe the metaphysics underlying some of what you were saying. I wonder if you could explain further the relationship between states in the sense at work here versus habits, virtues like religion and obedience and some of the other ones that you've mentioned here. The way that you were talking about states, the way that Aquinas was talking about them, makes them sound a lot like habits. They're stable dispositions too, I take it. So are they the same thing as habits, or what is the relationship there? Yeah.
As soon as you said metaphysics, I was like, I want to hide behind someone else who can do it.
Okay.
So let me take a stab at it. It is a good question. I suppose I would just start by saying that the state shapes what kind of habits I ought to be forming in order to be virtuous, right? That there's a temperance that's appropriate to a soldier, that's appropriate to various people in life, and that when I am in a state of life, and I think a first point is to say that we ought to seek to be in a fixed state. That we tend today kind of think of the good life as one that's free from kind of its fluid, right? That I ought to find a state, and once I'm in that state, I need to shape all of my habits to what is appropriate to that state. So the kind of prayer that's appropriate for a Dominican is not the kind that's appropriate for a Jesuit, is not the kind appropriate for a married person, and so forth. So that it's not that there are different virtues that we ought to have, but realizing that when we say someone has a virtue, we mean something about human nature in itself, but we also mean something about that specific person's dispositions and so forth, and about the vow or the state that they're in. And so we can imagine someone who has virtues, then enters a state of life and finds that he struggles to practice those virtues in this state and needs to, again, not go like, to something else, but to, and that's what I have to think through that part about, dispositions, habits, and virtues, but learn how to practice those virtues as virtue demands for that specific kind of state of life. So let's just try to think there. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
So our second presenter is Sandra. Dr. Sandra Hernández is a research professor of ethics and psychology at the Institute of Humanities at Panamerican University, Mexico. Her research focuses on the role of desires in achieving human excellence, a topic on which she developed her doctoral thesis at the International University of Catalonia, Spain. In the realm of desires, she relates to human action, motivations, affectivity, character, and the ethics of virtues. She holds a bachelor's degree in theology from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, and her talk today is entitled On Natural Desire through Alasdair MacIntyre's Thomism.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I renamed the title and I called it Understanding Desire through Alasdair MacIntyre's Thomistic Approach. I want to say before I start that it's very ambitious, the objective of this paper, so I'm very aware that this has a lot of limitations regarding the argumentation I'm going to present now. Anyway, so this work, I'm feeling this so close to me. Okay. Also, this work aligns with what Jonathan Lear refers to as an ethics of desires. It operates within anthropological ethics, focusing on human action and grounding itself in the foundations of Thomistic moral philosophy. The issue of desire is not a peripheral topic, but a central one for understanding human action and moral progress because of the complex interconnections between action, desires, and the good. This is why classical, medieval, and modern thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Hume, and Stevenson, among many others, extensively consider the topic of desires. One of the most characteristic features of the ethical perspective I present is that it involves desires as a fundamental expression of our humanity and as an essential driving force in pursuing a fulfilled life. Desires, ultimately, following MacIntyre, matters because of their relation to the success or failure of a life. While emotivism correctly recognizes the importance of emotions and desires, it is mistaken in confusing them with the good itself. In other words, emotivism tends to measure the good based on desire, where in an Aristotelian Thomistic focus, it should be the other way around. It is desires that the good should measure. This confusion between desires and goods has generated a profound moral and identity crisis, demonstrating the need for rethinking desire within contemporary moral philosophy. As a result of emotivism, there is a growing interest in a renewed focus on human desires within moral dialogue on both philosophical and theological levels. However, this contribution will focus solely on the philosophical dimension. Furthermore, the increasing importance of desire in contemporary ethical debate stems from factors inherent to the nature of desire. Below are some characteristics presented schematically. 1, interiority. Desires refer to a more interior and genuine dimension as opposed to more external or normative approach, allowing for a deeper access to the reality of the human subject. Totality. Desires engaged the person in their entirety. It integrates not just one aspect of our existence or a single type of desire, but it unites our affectivity, volitional, and rational dimensions, encompassing both rational and sensitive desires. Vital dimension. By taking desires in its starting point, this ethics becomes more existential. That is, it connects directly with the daily experiences and concrete lives of people, fostering interest and understanding. Integration. Many ethical approaches that prioritize the development of an active dimension tend to oscillate among three: will, affectivity, or action, often through character education. However, an ethics centered on desires goes beyond shaping will, affectivity, or conduct, and it takes an integrative approach encompassing all three dimensions. In other words, the ethics of desire builds on an anthropological conception that explains the potential harmony between the affective, moral, and psychological aspects of action, overcoming approaches like voluntarism. Alasdair MacIntyre is a contemporary author who has addressed the desire as a central aspect of morality. His thought here is relevant since Thomas Aquinas inspired him, and he considers himself a faithful and convinced Thomist. Therefore, this presentation discusses how Alasdair MacIntyre extends and develops the Thomistic notion of desire. If MacIntyre is indeed an authentic interpreter of Thomas Aquinas, at least concerning human desires, we will face a representative voice of Thomas Aquinas 800 years after Aquinas. The thesis asserts that MacIntyre extends the Thomistic concept of desire and develops it beyond Aquinas through the narrative notion of virtue. In the remainder of the exposition, I will present its central aspects, covering 3 points. One, I will discuss MacIntyre's notion of desire. Second, I will compare the MacIntyrean and the Thomistic notions of desire. And 3, I will conclude with an evaluative perspective on MacIntyre's concept of desire in light of Aquinas' thought. Regarding MacIntyre's notion of desire, I will highlight aspects that simultaneously reveal his original contribution with respect to the Thomistic notion of desire. First, MacIntyre's attention to desire stems from his need to establish the foundation of the good, based on the idea that action follows being. Therefore, desire is subordinated to the good, as demonstrated in his early writings. For example, as early as 1959, he questioned the relationship between what we are, what we can do, what we want to do, and what we ought to do. Although this question is not resolved then, it aims to find an answer that integrates desire into human action without detaching it from the good, unlike Hume, whom MacIntyre sharply criticizes. MacIntyre argues that separating morality and desires, favoring one over the other, leads to a moral desert, as history demonstrates. This perspective gradually develops and reaches its most mature form in Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, 2016, where he offers a more radical critique of emotivism, considering it a form of moral blindness in light of its denial of rational desire and the moral dimension of desire. Second, MacIntyre's notion of desires first draws from Aristotle and later from Aristotelian Thomism. Desire, say it, in a very poor way maybe, desire is the faculty responsible for initiating human movement and can activate various types of desires. Particular or concrete desires are the starting point for practical reasoning, connecting action and what is good with what is good. Third, the desiderative dimension is a complex faculty that even Aristotle avoids specifying in some respects, and Thomas Aquinas does not systematically develop it. Only through an adequate understanding of practical reasoning, it is possible to establish the natural relationship between the being of desire and the moral ought and the moral oft, a relationship that modern ethics has fragmented. Therefore, the Thomistic Aristotelian theory of action is a theory of the transmission and ordering of desires, providing reasons to return to an ethical system firmly based on the study of human motivations. Fourth, and perhaps the most original, or one of the most original aspects of MacIntyre's thought on desire, relies on narrative as a method to extend and specify the relationship between practical reasoning and desires. This narrative method links the universal nature of desire with its temporal and social dimension, addressing the particularities of action. The relationship between the universal and the particular aspect of desire has an eminently ethical purpose, that is, to provide the tools for evaluating one's desires that drive to action. Ideally, this evaluation would lead to distinguishing between desires and goods and measuring desires according to the particular goods they pursue, raising questions such as, how did I come to desire what I now desire, and some similar. This questioning focuses more on the psychology of the acting subject, a subject which with a clear awareness of what he wants, rather than conscious of the good itself. Reasoning based on desires ultimately distinguishes between desires and good and guides desire towards genuine goods. MacIntyre presents this evaluative reflection on desires through a process he calls cultural translation, adapting it to contemporary modes and practices. Fifth, dependency and vulnerability. MacIntyre highlights human dependency and vulnerability, emphasizing the communal nature of desire and the importance of care within communities. For his part, Aquinas acknowledges the social nature of humans, but places greater emphasis on the individual's relationship with God, giving less attention to interdependence. Finally, in this section, unlike Aquinas, MacIntyre introduces various keys to shaping desires according to authentic goods or goods in line with human nature. However, I will not develop this aspect here so that I can stay within the available time. Now, the aspects of MacIntyre's notion of desire that are most evidently drawn from Thomistic perspective are as follows. Both see human desires as directed towards an ultimate end. Aquinas emphasizes union with God, while MacIntyre focuses on human flourishing within traditions operating under the telos of human nature. Aquinas and MacIntyre stress the importance of virtue in directing desires. For Aquinas, virtues like prudence and temperance align desires with reason, essential for achieving happiness. MacIntyre similarly views virtues cultivated within practices as essential for ordering desires towards excellence and communal flourishing. Both thinkers link desire to the common good. Aquinas argues that individual desires should align with the common good, ultimately directed toward God. MacIntyre echoes this, emphasizing that desires are shaped and fulfilled within a social context, with flourishing being a communal achievement. Aquinas and MacIntyre stress the rational and voluntary aspects of desire. Aquinas sees desires as governed by reason and will, while MacIntyre, emphasizing rational desires, also addresses the conflict of desires and how virtue results it. Both critique disordered and arbitrary desires, insisting they must align with an objective good. Aquinas connects them to sin, while MacIntyre critiques modern social subjectivism. Aquinas distinguishes between natural and supernatural desires, with supernatural desire leading to ultimate fulfilling in God. Thought more focused on communal flourishing, MacIntyre agrees that finite desires are incomplete and must be aligned with a transcendent good. from what has been stated so far, two main differences emerge, which I summarize as follows. I mean differences between MacIntyre and Aquinas' concept of desire. So the 2 points are context and objective. Writing in the medieval Christendom, Aquinas aimed to integrate Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy, aligning human desires with natural and divine law. MacIntyre criticizes modern moral philosophy and the fragmentation of moral discourse. He seeks to revive Aristotelian Thomistic ethics within a social and historical framework, focusing on how traditions shape ethical life. Second, eternal law versus historical traditions. Aquinas presents desires as aligned with the eternal law of God, emphasizing universal principles applicable to all. In contrast, MacIntyre stresses the role of historically grounded traditions in shaping desires, arguing that modernity has eroded these traditions, leaving desires detached from coherent moral narratives. In this sense, he clarifies the significant influence of the social environment on desires, concluding that conflicts of desire, and thus moral conflicts, should not be interpreted solely as an individual deficiency. At the same time, MacIntyre emphasizes that human action, both in its individual and social dimensions, functions as it does, or may function, when rooted in natural grounds, and gives an account of the relationship between desires and human flourishing, open to God as the highest good satisfying human desires. As a conclusion, the points of convergence between Thomistic and MacIntyrean notions of desire outlined above, let us see how MacIntyre grounds his theory of desire in Thomas Aquinas and extends it. MacIntyre's theory operates on an anthropological, ethical, and psychological levels, aiming to engage in dialogue with particular sciences. Simultaneously, his development remains compatible with the transcendent and Thomistic Christian approach to desire. Moreover, he adapts abstract philosophical discourse to a practical and existential level, making it accessible to ordinary people and aligning with contemporary modes of reasoning. Translating Aquinas' thought into the contemporary world is essential to maintain its relevance in a philosophical sphere less inclined toward metaphysics and theology. This reinterpretation of Thomism aims to counteract the epistemological, moral, and social fragmentation we currently face. The extent to which MacIntyre's goal is fulfilled will become evident over time as his contributions continue to expand and be applied. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. My question is about desire.
Yeah.
What do you actually mean by desire? Is it like all what Aquinas would call the appetitive, sensitivus, intelectivus, and how do they relate? Is it what just comes up, what I feel? I know I have a desire for cake, or so. Could you? And is it one kind of desire, or could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what you're saying goes directly to the point of this ethical framework, because I mean the novelty of this is precisely that it's directed to all types of desires. You know, it can be sensitive or it can be rational. So it pretends like to overcome the sharp division that history of philosophy and practical life has made, like sensitive desires going like one direction and rational desires going the other direction. So MacIntyre interprets this division has caused in the person a very big moral conflict, that as far as we don't have like an anthropology that explains better the internal unity, it will remain this conflict like unsolved. So he considers that when we think as we decide in something, or many things, as in fact it happens, we can reorder our desires hierarchically, seeing all of them, because sensitive desires are good desires too. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's not the time, it's not the how, it's not the measure. So we need to rearrange our desires in the whole context of the corporal dimension, sensitive dimension, and rational dimension too. So what do MacIntyre, what do I or Thomas of Aquinas mean more specifically by desire? Desire is like the human dimension in charge of human movement. You know, so MacIntyre is very careful in identifying or in saying what is not a desire. So what doesn't move to action is not anthropologically a desire yet. I mean, I desire to be a princess. I mean, that will never happen. So it doesn't count as desire. I desire such a football game will be won by. There's nothing to do. I mean, I cannot do anything about it. So it doesn't count as desire. It's only the force that moves the person. It's when a movement is experienced to reach something. I don't know if that clarifies a little bit.
Yeah, yes,
yeah?
it does. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. And thanks for the paper. I guess I have two questions, and I'm going to push back a little bit. So one on traditions.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I would agree with MacIntyre,
Yeah.
but I want to defend him
on
tradition and say that his version of traditions isn't that you're kind of in one and then, so that puts you outside the natural law of Aquinas and the eternal law and whatnot. It's that I can't criticize the Humean tradition, for example, from within the natural law tradition of Aquinas. What I have to do is I have to learn everything I can. And I mean, he actually wrote an introduction to a selection of Hume's works. I have to learn everything I can within that tradition and then criticize it internally, find its shortcomings, and then look to another tradition that maybe can answer those shortcomings. And his conclusion in the end, if I understand him correctly, in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, as well as Too Many Thomisms, is this is the one so far that has been able to answer all of the questions.
Exactly.
So it's not that he's outside of the natural law, he's fully within it in that tradition sense. So I hesitate about the way you presented that part. And then this one is like, I don't know that I see a difference. So it sounds sexy and cool to talk about practices and narrative because it sounds like, ooh, Aquinas didn't do that. That's really interesting. But then part of me thinks, well, isn't that exactly what prudence does? Doesn't prudence have to know all of those particulars? Like if I'm going to know what's good for me here, now, at this moment, I have to flesh out that story, don't I? And isn't it prudence's job to flesh out that story? And I mean, and I think at one moment you said that Aquinas, doesn't have as much to say about prudence, but actually, he really takes it quite far in terms of a virtue. Plus, he goes beyond Aristotle, right? Like I think one of the things that if you did the MacIntyrean traditions thing, Aristotle doesn't have a concept of imprudence. No. But Aquinas does. Yeah, sure. Right? So don't we get at narrative? I mean, we don't get it in the kind of schwanky way that MacIntyre gives it to us today, so we can fit in with the social sciences. But I think it's there. Yeah, you're right. Well, there are many points here. Well, one of them is that, precisely about the traditions. What he says is that if we want to have a dialogue with different traditions, we need to learn like a second first language. So the second first language he chooses is emotivism. And besides, he's from England. He lived in the Humean environment, philosophically and practically speaking. So he knows very, very well that language.
So he chooses that one, and exactly, he tries to do an analysis that becomes an evaluative analysis. And he asserts that if we want to reborn the virtue ethics, it should be done on an Aristotelian way, or it won't be. So, yeah. The second point, if I understood correctly, yeah, I didn't say anything about prudence, at all. There is a lot of people who argues that MacIntyre doesn't follow or doesn't say anything about natural law, and all his moral judgments are based only on sociological grounds, which is super false. And I attribute that to partial reading of MacIntyre, because as you may know, as I see you are a good knower of MacIntyre, MacIntyre has had a long development in his thinking. And there was a point when he was like only Aristotelian, let's say. So the social context was like very determining for the moral judgment, you know? But as he goes on evolving in his thought, he discovers Thomas of Aquinas, and he explicitly says that he becomes a Thomistic Aristotelian. And he's very conscious that Aquinas develops Aristotle and overpasses him for so much, right? And what's the contribution? And I understand also your point that it's not like a myth that MacIntyre added something and maybe he just like putting it all together, like mixing it and say this is new. My appreciation and my research tells me that that's not like it. It seems so. Besides, it's difficult to understand as a whole MacIntyre's thought because it's like very dispersive, you know, it's something here and there. So to understand one single thing, it's like you need to follow everything and see what's like the conclusion. But in conclusion, I would humbly say maybe I need to go deeper into Thomas of Aquinas. But Thomas of Aquinas' thought, which is great, we all know and agree, I think, is like more static, you know? It's purely metaphysical, and he says how things are, and it's just perfect. His reasoning is so clear, complete, structured, etc. So what MacIntyre tries to do with narrative is going into, entering into the same truths, but with a methodology of narrative, which is not telling a story. It's not a narrative of just saying a story. It's nothing to do with that. For example, he says, our desires have a story. How did they, I mean, he wants to start where the people is. And he thinks, well, when Aristotle spoke, and maybe also Thomas of Aquinas, there was some like consensus of what good and evil or what good and bad was. Now there's a big confusion between what is good and bad. Even more, we cannot talk much about what's good because it's a very sensitive, I mean, it's a topic. Even, I mean, I teach ethics, and I've been like facing some syllabuses in different universities. And even in the university where I teach, the word, the good, it's not present in the syllabus itself, in an ethics course. So for me, it's like an example of how the good has become something we cannot talk about. So MacIntyre is very conscious of this, and so he like twists the things around. And he says, okay, people don't like to hear, and we don't like to speak about the good, because then we, you know. So he said, let's start the other way around. Let's start with the people is. So people, what they care about is what they desire, what they want. So let's reason about desires to enter into a more moral aspect of our desires. So that's where narrative starts. Why do I want this? Why my desires changed? Where are my desires driving me to? So that truth where the desires driving me is something different to my desires. So how do I measure desires? If they are all desires, how did I differentiate one desire from other? And the answer is I differentiate it because of the object towards they direct. So if I differentiate objects, I'm like detaching a little bit of my subjective not perception, but my senses, and analyzing the objects. So that through the objects, it's very simple, I can analyze my desires. But yes, there is a whole, let's say, not methodology, because he doesn't develop a methodology. He's not an educator, but he gives some clues of how the integration of the desires, of types of desires, may be done through narrative. But I wasn't like very explicit and didn't go into very in deep, because I wanted to be like, give like a bigger picture and comparison. And I'm sorry about that, but yeah, there's much to say about narrative. I don't know if I answered something satisfactory. Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. I think it's time, right? Thank you.